Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video on this channel where we continue our series on Dapr. We already posted a couple of videos that talk about Dapr service-to-service invocation, a little bit about state management, and so forth. We mainly covered the basics. Now in this case, we are going to create a custom component that is able to write to InfluxDB. Maybe you've seen in one of my videos or in my blog posts that I was using the MQTT component, which is a default component available today in Dapr, which makes it very easy to read of an MQTT topic and then do something with that data. I was thinking of writing all of this MQTT data to some time series database. One of the time series databases that I like to use is InfluxDB. You can use this locally. You can use the cloud version. It doesn't really matter what version you take here. But of course, there is no component to write to InfluxDB. So we could, of course, handle this ourselves and use the InfluxDB APIs for Python or for JavaScript or Go or any other language. But I thought, yeah, let's write a component for this and have it as a plugin to Dapr. So the idea goes like this. You have your application, which could be anything, but in this case, it's a Python app. The Python app is going to read topics of an MQTT queue and get them in the app. Now that's something that I didn't implement, but it would be easy to do. And then the Python app would do an HTTP post to the Dapr sidecar. And the Dapr sidecar knows how to write the data, the contents to InfluxDB, by means of this separate component that you can write for Dapr. Okay, let's take a look at how that would work specifically. So how do you write such a component? Well, what you first of all should do is take a look what the team has put on GitHub. So in Dapr components contrib, and that's by the way the repository where you would have to do a pull request to have your component integrated into the software. There is also there a README MD, a developing component.md markup file that talks about developing a new component. Yeah, just read through that. I'm not going to go in detail about what's in here. The only thing that I did differently is I didn't clone Dapr and component contrib directly. Of course, I first forked them to my own space on GitHub and then cloned those forked repositories. So I have them on my system ready to add code to it. The next step, of course, is to then write the actual component. But before we do that, I want to show you the calling code, because when you're going to use Dapr and talk to some kind of third-party system via a component, so in this case InfluxDB, you will have to specify a component YAML file. That's the same with all the other components in Dapr. So in this case, we can think of a component YAML file of type bindings influx, and of course I will use the influx name when I create the binding to make sure this matches. And in this case, I need to provide some metadata to this component. I need to specify the URL to connect to. In this case, that's a cloud-based URL, so using also HTTPS to connect to the InfluxDB time series database. We need a token to connect. You need to create that token at the InfluxDB level, and that will allow you read and or write access. You can decide, of course, what kind of access you require. What InfluxDB also requires these days is an organization and a bucket. So that's also specified using these metadata values that you provide to the component. That also means that our code, the InfluxDB component, will have to pick up these values and do something with it. So keep this in mind, that a big chunk of the code will of course be to read this data. Now let's go to the actual code, and that's the one here. So this is, and it's important, we are now in components contrib, so in that forked repository that I cloned to my local system. And because we're creating a binding, in the bindings folder, I create a folder called influx, and then I have two files, the influx go and the influx test go. You should have a test. In this case, it's really a minimal test, a bit similar to how the MQTT test is done. It's almost the same, basically. So I decided to just keep testing minimal at this point in time, and maybe I have to improve that, but we'll see about that later. And then, of course, the actual code, which is the Go code that implements the output binding. Of course, you don't have to write this from scratch. There are several input and output bindings available already in the source code. In my case, it was very similar to what I wanted to do with the MQTT component. I'm just not reading from InfluxDB, so I removed that code from it. So it's heavily based on, of course, an existing component that's already available and given to you, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Good. Let's take a look at some of the code. I'm not going to go into detail. Of course, we need some InfluxDB imports here because we're going to write to InfluxDB, so we're going to use their APIs and their packages for it. Our main struct is here, which will hold the metadata, but also the InfluxDB client. And important also, with InfluxDB, you have several types of APIs to write. You have a non-blocking and a blocking API. We are going to use the blocking API to write data to InfluxDB. And there's also a logger field there that you have to have, which is required in the code. Then we have a struct to hold our metadata, as you have seen in the metadata file, in the YAML file, a URL, a token, an org, and a bucket. And then, of course, when you specify the metadata file and you tell Dapr, I want to use this InfluxDB component, then the component needs to be initialized. So Dapr will call init on your component, and it will pass in the metadata it reads from the YAML file. What I'm doing here is I'm just using get influx metadata to parse that metadata field, and then I'm checking the actual values of those 4 fields that I require, and I really require them. So if they are empty, we're going to raise an error, and we're going to specify if we require the URL or the token, and so forth. When we have our parameters provided, we can create an InfluxDB client where we pass the URL and the token to properly authenticate. We save that client in our struct, and then we are going to instantiate a write API, use the write API blocking method, and specify the org and the bucket. Of course, this is InfluxDB specific. This is really the basics of InfluxDB. There's nothing really special going on here. If you find some code provided by Influx, you of course will find this very easily, how this has to be done. Good. So that means I now have my write API available, and that one I can use. So I.write API, I can use that one to start writing to my database. Where does that happen? Well, that happens here. Now, with an InfluxDB component, you first of all have to indicate to Dapr what operations that you support. So Dapr will call this operations method, and in this case, we return that we support the create operation. The calling application will have to specify that it wants to use this create operation. When the calling application is successfully indicating I want to do a create, then whenever that create is requested, the invoke method will be triggered. And the invoke method, of course, also gets a request parameter, and that contains, for example, if we use Python and we do a post request, that contains the data we send in that request. So there's a field in rec, which is rec data, and that in our case contains data that we require specifically for InfluxDB. So this rec data field will contain some JSON. We will parse that JSON, and we will have a measurement, the tags, and the values. And those ones are used to construct just a line of text, a simple string really, but that uses the protocol API, the line protocol API that InfluxDB provides. So it's a specific string that InfluxDB understands and that contains the measurement we're going to write, the tags for our measurement, and then the actual values. So of course you need to properly format this in your calling application. If it's not properly formatted, of course there will be an error thrown here. When we do the actual write with write record, an error will be thrown and we will say we cannot write that point, and that's it. We have written the point and it's done, right? So this is the actual binding. Of course you have to do a couple of things like run make test, that your tests are properly running. Have to run make lint, and that there are no linting error, because if you're going to do a pull request, they will run make lint as well. So you have to make sure that you pass the make lint phase. And now we can actually try and test and see how this works within Dapr. So what we have to do is we have to compile our own Dapr-D executable. And you see this here. This is the source code of Dapr, which was also forked and pulled down, cloned on my system. And you'll find the code to Dapr-D in cmd dapr-d main.go. In main.go, you have to do two things. First of all, you can see it here. You have to add your influx binding package that needs to be imported, needs to be part of the imports. Of course, importing is not enough. You will also have to make sure that you instantiate that component. So you'll find in the runtime with output bindings here, you will find that we added some code, bindings loader, to load the binding. And in this case, we load the output binding, which is influx. And we use the new influx method to do so, right? So those two changes have been made to main.go of Dapr-D. And that means we can actually compile our own Dapr-D executable here for local testing. So if we go here, there's actually we are in the Dapr repository here. What you can do here is basically say we're going to do a make debug is one, and then build, and that would build Dapr-D. I'm not going to run that now. After it's successfully built, you will have a file in the dist folder. So in dist linux debug Dapr-D, you just copy that over to your user local bin, and you basically replace the Dapr-D that you probably already had installed coming off the Dapr-D repo. So the official Dapr-D, in my case version 0.9.0, I think. So Dapr-D is now replaced. That also means that we can run some client code to see how this works. So the client code is here. As I said, we specify a component because we need to specify to Dapr that we want to use the influx binding. That's the one that you see over here. And then the actual code, just the same as before, it's a binding. So to call or to use a binding, you construct a URL that refers to the binding. So in this case, that's the URL. Localhost, in this case 3500, which is Dapr running on my machine, running my Py code as well. It's the same as in Kubernetes. This would go to the Dapr sidecar. And then of course v1.0/binding/influx, where influx refers to the name of the component. So the name of the component is influx. So in the actual binding call, I'm using the influx name as well. Of course, we're going to do a post here. So we use a requests object in Python to do a post to that URL, but we need to specify a payload. And take into account the payload looks like this. The payload needs to contain a data field and an operation field. And the operation clearly here has to be create. So we indicate that we want to do a create operation. That will trigger the invoke method in our component because we are sending create to that component, to that binding. The data is specific to InfluxDB. As you have seen, it's using measurement tags and values to construct a correct string that adheres to the line protocol of InfluxDB. So measurement, call it temperature, tags, which is just additional information about my values that I'm recording. So like room is dorm, building is building A. these tags are actually indexed for easier lookup in InfluxDB. Now we have some values that are being saved. So in this case, a string value sensor x, where we do some escaping as well to have it with spaces and to have proper quotes around it. And then we record an average and a max value, and that's of course just this n that's always ever increasing. And yeah, the average is n and the max is n times 2. That's not important. I just want to have something moving along in my graphics. For the rest, that's not so important. But this payload needs to be given properly to this post, and that normally should be enough to write to InfluxDB. So let's see if this really works. And for that to work, we have to of course call our code with Dapr. So we do Dapr run. We give it an app ID of our choosing. It doesn't have to be Influx. And important here, we specify the components path, because I want to use my custom component, which is influx.yaml. That one needs to be used, and then we run our app. When we do so, you'll see that indeed my application is logging out a couple of values. It's logging out the entire payload, and it also logs the response we get from Dapr. So the post to Dapr is successful, which also means that in my component there was not really an error. So let's check out to see what Dapr here has said. Well, first of all, you'll see that that he found the component influx. He found that file influx.yaml, so the component was found, and then a bit later he will also initialize the output binding for influx. That was also properly done. If there are errors like you miss, for example, a metadata field and so on, there will of course be an error here, and it won't work. Let's just simulate that. So if we are just stopping this here, and we are typing here URLs, which is of course wrong, and we run Dapr run, of course you get a response 500, something went wrong, and you'll clearly see as well that he failed to init the output binding influx. The influx error was URL required. That's clear. The URL needs to be there. It needs to be properly in there, otherwise it won't work. Let's stop this code again and let's do it successfully. Let's take a look in Influx to see if the data is arriving there. So I'm going to InfluxDB Cloud. By the way, you can go to Influx and get your own instance of InfluxDB. You can get a free one and just try out and see how it works. So in my case, I created one with an organization called Inity, with a bucket called Inity bucket, and within that Inity bucket I can find my measurements. So here you see I use the measurement temp. We have several fields here. I'm just going to select the numeric field, so average and max, and then I can do filters. For example, filters based on the tags. So I can do filter based on building, filter based on room, or no filters. But let's just filter on the room just for fun. Select just the dorm values. I only have dorm values here, and then submit this, right? So this is the one that we're having at this point in time. Let's refresh this a bit and see what gives. Let's also go back to our application here, and yeah, it's posting that data now. So we'll see how far we get here, right? Yeah, we had very high values from the past because we were at 50,000 already. So these ones are, you cannot really see it very well here, but you can clearly see that the value for max is 32. Here, of course, they were much higher, and so here you had values of 68,000. Because I think by accident I let it run the whole night. That's not too important. I can also show, for instance, the table values here. And there you see from before these very high values, but currently the values we have at the moment, they are much lower, because they again start from that lower value. As you can see here, these are the current values with the current timestamps here. So the data is properly ending up in InfluxDB. Note that, yeah, it's a time series database, but I didn't really specify in the line protocol, I didn't specify the timestamp. Maybe something that I should add. When the timestamp is not added from your client code, the timestamp of the server is being used. It's normally not recommended. You should, from your calling application, from the client application, you should actually pass in the timestamp. So there's some room for improvement in the InfluxDB component to get that right as well. So what did you see now, or what did we see? We saw this section here. So we wrote our own InfluxDB component for Dapr. We compiled our own version of Dapr-D that contains this component, so we can do some local testing. And then we tested the component from a Python app, which is doing a simple HTTP post to the binding that we have provided, the influx binding. And you have also seen that, yes, you need to provide a payload with a data and operation field. And the data field is, of course, specific to the InfluxDB component, with the operation being create. So that's it. I hope you found this interesting. See you next time for another video. Bye bye.